Okay, I do it from here, so only the speakers have the privilege to sit. I want to, I started reading, or I received the two papers in one mail and read them almost parallelly. So on the one hand, I try to briefly summarize what struck me most, and secondly, also to commend them, but that is, I think they have some in common. And I start with Cécile Weissier. I really, with being moved, I read about the story of these courageous actors in the theater trying to fight the oblivion, the ignorance that came up. And so when by recalling or by referring not only to single or a kind of single accumulation of single stories, but just on the effect that had on society, and that they were claiming or were complaining about still living in a society that hadn't undergone, and I think at the end of your paper you used that word, therapy. I might use that, well, there is lot of convincing things in it, down to the level of that one of the pieces is called I Am, and this morning I wondered how that might be related, how that might be related to Armatavos Etania, which was also quoted by Katja in this morning. It's a difficult relation, so it's not like I am or I'm not, but just two strains of history. But also whether there might be a gender aspect to it, because those mostly committing suicide or drinking, also it's I think sometimes one wonders, it's the men. But one other point I would like to make, and that is whether you use the word therapy at the end, or, well, this kind of psychology, but what those women address and what these actors address is not only single stories, it's not like healing the memory of individuals, but it's like healing society. And that reminded me of the German word Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is also mostly related to society. But I recall when I started working here in Holland some 10 years ago, that there was a television series also dealing with places, sites of memory throughout Europe, written by the writer Geert Mak. And one of the sites of memory was Berlin, and referring to the Nazi occupation and Nazi, the Third Reich. And then the word Vergangenheitsbewältigung was commented in the way it's only the Germans who could invent such a term. You know? What he meant by that, he didn't say. But it seems to me that there was perhaps taken a little bit of a shortcut. Yeah? So you heal society, but you don't heal the memory of the individuals. And that was this Vergangenheitsbewältigung, this is what I learned as well, is always related to, say, paving the ground for a liberal society, whereas maybe the step before is reconciliation and peace. Yeah, so that's my question mark and remark. Well, it's about theology after Gulag, so I might be forgiven for addressing also this more theological dimension. And then maybe that builds the bridge to the account of Boris Belenkin, which I also, well, again, it's like you start with the question, where does the silence come from? Same as in the first presentation, and there is a number of answers to it. I think in that case, more obvious than in the others. Well, one is that just the church, which hadn't perhaps in some Siberian regions not been that established before, even in Tsarist times, is now completely eradicated, and that's so the annihilation efforts were successful. That's the more simple interpretation. But I think also here we have to do with the question of not so much the absence of any memory, but the competition of other memories. Yeah, so it's like, and they were addressed, the official Russian Orthodox Church collaborating with well, collaboration sounds badly, and sometimes it's just making compromises, or others would say try to survive. So here we have, and that had been introduced by Alexander Agajanian this morning, we also have this story which is now upheld by the Russian Orthodox Church. It's our martyrs, the Novomuchniki, the new martyrs. And the strange thing is that, well, there is the cult of the new martyrs, but no one tells the story of the priests. So what martyrs are they speaking of? Or in other terms, is that triumphant story of the new martyrs, which according even to church historians with clerical background, would have fertilized the ground, would have been the seed for the church flourishing after the downfall of communism, is that rather triumphant story, not rather against the real story of the martyrs. Going one step further, and that's again a bit like a church historian, do we exactly know what a martyr is? Except for a hero, except for someone who has the moral victory on his part. Maybe there is the martyr, the more humble story of those just staying in place of winning, or the more humble story of those just testifying instead of claiming their role in a great cause. So perhaps some redefinition of the actual martyr has to be done, also in the sense, what would we know? I think, Boris, you refer on one point to the early church. The early church knows also the story, say, after the end of persecution, between brackets, mostly those persecutions in the ancient church history were some maximum 10 years, but no one spoke of 70 years of communist regime, so there's no change of generation in it. But of course, the historians also do not know only those heroically remaining or standing on or sacrificing their lives as we are used to here, but they have also those standing by or just making compromises. Among them, those who could even save other lives by making compromises. And we have also, after the end of the persecution, say this is North Africa in the 3rd century, for example, or Julian Apostata, as you mentioned, we have the case of the so-called lapsi, which is the fallen, those who made compromises, but this is a word of hardliners afterwards, who wouldn't forgive those who made compromises. I think this is also a struggle which affects the Russian Orthodox Church today, in the sense that how to go on with those who made, well, compromise. I'm looking for so this is not only a story of, the story of martyrs is not a story of heroes, perhaps, not to be misinterpreted, but the story of those who were not heroes and those who made compromise, still something to be reconciled with as well. May that suffice for the moment as impulses. Thank you.